The ceaseless thrum of the boat's engine was a blunt instrument against Dean's skull, a dull percussion echoing the hollow space where his heart used to reside. He gripped the salt-encrusted railing, his knuckles white against the peeling paint, and stared out at the churning slate-gray water. The mainland, a smudge of green and brown, had long since vanished behind a wall of mist, leaving him adrift in an expanse of ocean that felt both liberating and terrifyingly vast. He'd sought isolation, a hermitage from the world that had fractured around him, and the island, a jagged tooth on the horizon, promised exactly that. The inheritance had been a shock. A solicitor's crisp letter, smelling faintly of old paper and dust, had informed him of his estranged grandfather's passing and the unexpected bequest. A lighthouse keeper's cottage on a forgotten island, a place Dean hadn't even known existed until the coordinates were provided. It felt less like an inheritance and more like a final cryptic summons from a man he'd never truly known. A cartographer's last, most desolate charted point. Dean, a cartographer himself, had found a grim irony in the arrangement. He mapped the known world. His grandfather, it seemed, had preferred the edges. The fishing trawler, piloted by a silent, weather-beaten man whose face was a roadmap of sun and wind, finally cut its engine. The sudden quiet was profound, broken only by the mournful cry of gulls and the rhythmic sigh of the waves against the hull. Ahead, the island rose from the sea like a hunched beast, its spine a ridge of black rock, its flanks draped in a thick, pearlescent fog that swallowed the upper reaches of the abandoned lighthouse. "Here we are," the boatman grunted, his voice raspy as he pointed a calloused hand towards a narrow, treacherous-looking dock. "Last stop." Dean nodded, his throat tight. He stepped onto the rickety wooden planks, the wood groaning beneath his weight. The air was heavy, saturated with the metallic tang of salt, the decaying sweetness of kelp, and something else. A faint, earthy scent, like disturbed soil or ancient stone. He dragged his worn duffel bag and a crate of supplies across the dock, the wheels of the hand truck rattling a lonely tune. The boatman, without another word, turned the trawler, its engine coughing back to life, and dissolved into the fog, leaving Dean utterly alone. He stood for a long moment, the silence pressing in, the fog a living, breathing presence around him. The abandoned lighthouse itself was a skeletal finger piercing the mist, its glassless lantern room a gaping, empty eye. Below it, clinging to the cliff face like a barnacle, was the cottage. The path leading up to it was overgrown, choked with thorny brambles and resilient coastal grasses. The cottage, when he finally reached it, was even more derelict than he'd imagined. Gray, weather-beaten planks formed its walls, the paint long since flaked away, revealing the raw, bleached wood beneath. Windows were boarded up or broken, shards of glass glinting like scattered teeth. The porch sagged, its supports rotten, and the front door, a heavy slab of oak, hung askew on a single rusted hinge. The interior was a cavern of gloom, the air thick with the smell of mildew, damp earth, and something indefinable, something ancient and still. Dust motes danced in the sparse beams of light that pierced the gaps in the boarded windows, illuminating the swirling motes like tiny, forgotten stars. Dean stepped inside, his boots scuffing against a gritty floor. The cottage was a testament to neglect, a monument to a life lived in stark solitude. A heavy wooden table stood in the center of what must have been the main room, its surface scarred and stained. Dust sheets draped over what he assumed were furniture, their ghostly forms suggesting a previous occupant had merely vanished, leaving everything in place. He pulled back one of the sheets from a lumpy armchair, revealing faded floral upholstery, stiff with disuse. He found the bedroom easily enough, a small, cramped space with a single, narrow cot. A tattered blanket lay folded at its foot, and a small wooden chest of drawers stood against one wall. He dropped his duffel bag onto the cot, the mattress groaning softly. He felt a profound weariness settle into his bones, a fatigue that went beyond the journey. As he turned to survey the room, a faint, almost imperceptible sound caught his attention. A soft, rhythmic thump, thump, thump. It seemed to come from the floorboards beneath his feet, or perhaps the wall beside him. He froze, listening intently. The sound was subtle, barely audible over the rush of blood in his ears, like something heavy and soft being nudged against a surface, deep within the foundations of the cottage. He told himself it was the house settling, the old wood creaking, or the distant murmur of the sea carried by the wind. But the rhythm felt too deliberate, too consistent to be random. He moved to the window, pulling back a corner of the tattered blackout curtain. Outside, the fog had thickened, pressing against the glass like a blind gray face. He could no longer see the sea, only the swirling, impenetrable whiteness. The thump, thump, thump continued, a quiet, insistent pulse. It felt like something waking up, something that had been dormant for a very long time, now stirring beneath the very ground he stood upon. He dragged his worn duffel bag across the rough planks, the wood groaning beneath his weight. He watched the boatman's vessel shrink against the immense gray of the sea, a solitary smudge on the horizon, until only the rhythmic churn of the waves against the craggy shore remained. He was truly alone. The cottage was smaller than he'd imagined from the probate photos, hunkered low against the wind-battered cliff face. Its whitewash was peeling, the windows opaque with salt spray, and the roof sagged like a tired shoulder. He pushed open the heavy oak door, which protested with a shriek that seemed to echo long after the sound should have died. Inside, the air was cold and still, thick with the smell of mildew and forgotten things. His first task was to make the place habitable. He unrolled his sleeping bag on a narrow cot in the main room, then began to unpack the few supplies he'd brought. Canned goods, a kettle, a battery-powered lamp. The silence pressed in on him, broken only by the distant shush of the waves. Yet, a subtle unease began to prickle at the edges of his resolve. Later, as twilight bled across the sky, painting the clouds in bruised purples and grays, Dean stepped outside to stretch his legs. He walked along the narrow, uneven path that snaked towards the abandoned lighthouse, a towering sentinel of rusted iron and crumbling brick. The wind picked up, whipping his hair across his face, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible sound. It was like a low hum or a deep, drawn-out sigh just beneath the roar of the surf. He paused, straining his ears, but it vanished, swallowed by the relentless ocean. Just the wind, he decided, playing tricks. He didn't try to enter. The structure looked unstable, a monument to a forgotten age. It was unusually high, lapping at rocks that, according to his grandfather's old charts, should have been well clear of the water's edge. He, a cartographer, understood the sea's rhythms intimately, and this felt wrong. He attributed it to a particularly strong spring tide, an anomaly he hadn't accounted for. He stopped, holding his breath, his hand still on the latch of a dusty cupboard. It wasn't words, not exactly, but a suggestion of them, a low, guttural murmur that seemed to resonate in the very floorboards. It felt ancient, like the sound of shifting tectonic plates. His spine stiffened. He shook his head, pushing the irrational thought away. The wind, he reiterated to himself, finding its way through a crack in the old stone. The house was settling. He needed to organize the cottage. His grandfather had been a man of habit, and Dean hoped to find some order amidst the chaos of inherited possessions. He started with a heavy, salt-stained sea chest tucked into a corner. Inside, beneath layers of moth-eaten wool and yellowed navigational tools, his fingers brushed against something hard and damp. He pulled it out. A leather-bound journal, its cover warped and swollen, pages fused together in places by sea spray and age. The leather was embossed with a faded, intricate pattern that he couldn't quite decipher in the dim light. He carried it to the small, scarred wooden table and carefully opened it. The first few pages were blank, or perhaps too damaged to read. But deeper within, the script appeared. His grandfather's familiar, elegant hand, now spidery and erratic, scrawled across the brittle paper. The ink had bled in places, blurring words, but the disturbing sketches were undeniable. Grotesque, bulbous forms with too many eyes, sinuous tentacles reaching from impossible depths, and strange geometric symbols that seemed to writhe on the page. His stomach clenched. His gaze snagged on a recurring phrase, underlined repeatedly, almost savagely. The deep song. Warnings were interspersed with the drawings, fragmented thoughts that clawed at his composure. It calls from below. The pact, forgotten, now stirs. Don't listen to the deep song. The entries grew more frantic, the handwriting descending into a frenzied scribble. This wasn't the ramblings of a lonely old man. This felt like a desperate plea, a terrifying confession. He stared at the journal, his rational mind struggling to reconcile the bizarre entries with the man he remembered. A quiet, reserved individual, not one prone to flights of macabre fantasy. Perhaps the isolation had finally broken him. The sea, the constant roar, the solitude. It could warp a mind. He tried to tell himself that the sketches were just fevered imaginings, a descent into madness brought on by years of solitary confinement on this desolate rock. Dean felt a cold dread bloom in his chest. Yet the scrawled warnings felt too immediate, too raw to dismiss as mere senility. A gnawing unease settled deep in his stomach, a cold anchor pulling him down. He couldn't simply ignore it. The need to understand, to rationalize, propelled him. Dean spent the next few days sifting through every dusty book, every faded map in the cottage. The few volumes his grandfather had kept were mostly nautical charts and weather almanacs, but tucked away in a small, damp-stained chest, Dean found a collection of local histories, poorly bound and smelling of salt and mildew. He spread them out on the kitchen table, the lamp casting a sickly yellow glow over the brittle pages. One particular pamphlet, titled Tales of the Deep Island Lore, detailed local legends. Dean's fingers traced the faded print, a prickle of recognition running down his spine. It spoke of a forgotten city beneath the waves, a place of cyclopean architecture swallowed by the sea millennia ago. The narrative suggested a time when the island was not merely a rock in the ocean, but a gate, a threshold. He returned to his grandfather's journal, the cryptic entries now illuminated by the lurid glow of folklore. The pact, his grandfather had written, must be honored. And later, the price is too high. What choice do we have? Dean reread the passages describing the murmurs from below, the shifting of the deep. It wasn't just a city, it was something alive. The journal didn't speak of a treaty, but a bargain, a desperate negotiation to keep something vast and ancient dormant. His grandfather hadn't been fighting a personal demon. He had been a guardian, bound by a terrible inherited duty. What kind of burden was that to carry, alone on this desolate rock? Sleep offered no escape. His nights became a churning maelstrom of vivid, disturbing dreams. Sometimes in these dreams, he saw faint, fleeting flashes of impossible structures, colossal and alien, half-formed in the gloom, their surfaces slick and glistening. He would wake gasping, his skin clammy, the phantom taste of salt and decay lingering on his tongue. One morning, after a particularly suffocating dream where he felt tendrils brushing against his bare skin, Dean rose, his head thick with a dull ache. He walked into the small, damp kitchen, intending to brew coffee. His gaze fell upon the stone floor near the sink. A faint, ethereal glow emanated from the grout lines. He knelt, his breath catching in his throat. Tiny, delicate tendrils of something bioluminescent were growing there. A network of shimmering blue-green light against the gray stone. It pulsed almost imperceptibly, like a slow, deep breath. He touched it tentatively. He recoiled, a shiver running through him. He checked the other rooms. In the pantry, a faint luminescence outlined the bottom of a wooden shelf. In the corner of the small bedroom, a patch the size of his palm clung to the rough plaster, a vibrant, otherworldly beacon in the dim light. It wasn't a fungus he recognized, nor any algae from the shore. This was something else, something that pulsed with the same unsettling rhythm he'd felt in his dreams. The journal lay open on the warped pine table, its aged pages a testament to his grandfather's desperate final days. Dean's gaze traced the hurried, almost manic script, each word a cold ember settling in his gut. He had expected a quiet legacy, a simple inheritance, not a chilling testament to a lurking horror. His mind, usually a fortress of logic and cartographic precision, found itself under siege. He remembered his grandfather as a man of quiet habits, meticulous and reserved, not one to succumb to fanciful delusions. Dean clutched the edge of the table, knuckles white. He wouldn't run. He would understand. The hum started subtly, a low thrum beneath the floorboards, barely perceptible above the wind's mournful sigh around the cottage. He dismissed it at first, a draft, the house settling, the distant groan of the island itself. But it persisted, a resonant bass note that seemed to vibrate not just in the air, but in his very teeth. He pressed his palms to his ears, but the sound simply shifted, a pressure building behind his eyes, a phantom vibration in his skull. He tried to focus, to reread the journal, but the words blurred, their meaning elusive under the weight of the insistent hum. He stood, pacing the small living area. As he passed the narrow hallway mirror, a flicker caught his eye. He stopped, turning back. He blinked, and the image normalized, his own weary face staring back, lines of stress etched around his mouth. He squinted, leaning closer, scrutinizing every detail. Nothing. Just his own tired features. His heart hammered a disjointed rhythm against his ribs. A book on a nearby shelf, an old nautical almanac, suddenly slid forward, tumbling to the floor with a dull thud. Dean jumped, his breath catching. There was no vibration, no movement in the floorboards that could have dislodged it. He bent slowly, retrieving the almanac. Its cover felt strangely damp, though the air in the cottage was dry. A shiver crawled up his spine. This was no longer just a journal's frightening tale. It was seeping into his reality. Driven by a desperate need to find answers, to either corroborate or debunk his grandfather's claims, Dean decided to explore the abandoned lighthouse. The hum, now a constant companion, seemed to intensify as he stepped out into the swirling mist that perpetually clung to the island. The air was thick with the scent of brine and decaying seaweed, a raw, primal smell that clawed at his throat. Inside, the circular stairwell spiraled upwards into gloom. He climbed, his hands scraping against the rough, salt-encrusted stone. On the landing just below the lantern room, he found it. Carved into the stone wall, beneath a layer of peeling whitewash, were crude, deep gouges. Not just random marks, but symbols. Concentric circles, wavy lines, shapes that evoked the crushing pressure of the deep sea. His grandfather hadn't just feared, he had acted. He had tried to ward off, or perhaps appease, whatever malevolence stalked this island. The discovery solidified the terrifying truth. The old man wasn't mad. He was fighting. As Dean turned from the grim display, the hum swelled, throbbing violently in his head. The very air grew dense, pressing in on him. It was a deeper shade of black against the already dim light, formless yet cohesive, like a column of churning, ink-dark water. It wasn't moving through the air. It was part of it, a localized distortion, a ripple in reality itself. He stumbled back, his foot catching on the uneven stone, slamming his shoulder against the wall. Dean stood frozen, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, his lungs burning. It had been there. He had seen it, and it had seen him. His fingers, still stained with the briny scent of the sea, trembled slightly as he turned another page. But as the dates marched forward, the tone shifted. The neat hand became jagged, the ink often smudged as if the old man had been writing in a hurry, or perhaps in a tremor. Dean leaned closer, the smell of damp paper and ancient dust filling his nostrils. The hum grows, a pressure in the bones. It demands a response, not just observation. It seeks acknowledgement. Acknowledgement. Dean frowned, a knot tightening in his stomach. What kind of acknowledgement? He read on, his eyes scanning for context. The entries became less about what his grandfather saw and more about what he did. The ritual of binding must be maintained. The wards weaken with each passing tide. The island remembers. The deep song, it calls. Dean's breath hitched. Ritual of binding? Wards? This wasn't the rambling of a lonely old man. It was a desperate plea, a confession. He had been actively involved. The image of his grandfather, a man Dean had barely known, performing some arcane rite in the solitude of the abandoned lighthouse, was both terrifying and unbelievable. The journal spoke of keeping the veil thin, yet unbroken, of feeding the dormancy. It was all too clear. His grandfather had been performing a ritual to keep whatever lurked beneath the waves from fully awakening. And now, Dean was here. A low thrum began, not in the room, but deep within his own skull. It was subtle at first, a vibration against his eardrums, like a distant ship's engine, yet too pervasive, too close. The air in the cottage grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. He pushed the journal away, its revelations a heavy burden. The deep song. Was this it? He stood, stumbling slightly, and walked to the window. The fog outside had thickened, pressing against the glass like a hungry, opaque entity. It wasn't just white mist. It felt alive. A vast, silent watcher. His reflection stared back at him, eyes wide and bloodshot. He blinked, and the image snapped back to normal, leaving him breathless, his heart hammering against his ribs. Hallucination. It had to be. A trick of the light, a symptom of exhaustion, or perhaps the insidious onset of the deep song. He paced the small living space, his gaze darting across familiar objects that now seemed subtly wrong, distorted, imbued with a malevolent energy. His eyes fell upon a specific passage in the journal, a hurried scrawl beneath a sketch of a strange circular symbol. The heart of the light, it read. Where the song is strongest, where the binding holds. The phrase echoed in his mind, cutting through the growing cacophony of the deep song. He moved towards it, his steps unsteady, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He knelt before the hearth, running his hands over the rough, cold stones. One stone, larger than the rest, felt slightly loose. He pulled it out, a tarnished, heavy iron ring set into a hinged stone slab. A hidden chamber, a crypt, beneath the abandoned lighthouse. With a surge of adrenaline, he pulled the ring. The stone slab, far heavier than it looked, groaned as it lifted, revealing a gaping black maw. The deep song roared in his ears now, no longer a hum, but a full-blown assault on his senses, a cacophony of soundless screams and crushing pressure. The air down there felt denser, heavier, imbued with an undeniable malevolence. This was where his grandfather had performed his rituals. This was the heart of the light, and it was calling to Dean. The deep song pulsed, a low thrumming beneath the floorboards, vibrating through the very soles of his worn boots. Dean stood before the old stone hearth in the abandoned lighthouse. The chill draft he'd felt before now a distinct, icy current against his ankles. He knelt, fingers tracing the rough-hewn stones, searching. The mortar between them was crumbling in places, thick with generations of dust and forgotten ash. His gaze, sharpened by a desperate resolve, settled on a particular stone, larger than the rest, nestled low to the floor on the inner right side of the hearth. It wasn't quite flush. A hairline crack, almost invisible, ran along its edge. He pressed against it, then pulled, but it remained stubbornly in place. The deep song intensified, a deep, resonating hum that seemed to vibrate in his teeth. A wave of unease washed over him, a premonition of something vast and ancient stirring just beyond his perception. He pushed again, harder, exploring the edges. He dug his thumbnail into it, found purchase, and twisted. A soft click echoed, impossibly loud in the thrumming silence. With a groan of ancient stone on stone, the hearth's base, not just the single block, began to slide inwards, revealing a rectangular opening. A gust of air, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something else. Something metallic and briny, like old blood mixed with sea salt, billowed out, carrying with it a faint, cloying sweetness. Dean recoiled, his stomach clenching. The stone steps were uneven, slick with a pervasive moisture that clung to his clothes. He had no light, but a faint phosphorescent glow like foxfire emanated from below, casting a sickly green pallor on the rough-hewn walls. The passage spiraled downwards, the air growing heavier, the pressure building in his ears. He thought of his grandfather, the man who had lived his life here, tending the light. Had he known about this? Had he kept this secret? Or had he simply been another victim of its insidious pull? Finally, the tunnel opened into a small, irregular chamber. The phosphorescent glow was stronger here, radiating from the very center of the space. And in the heart of it, bathed in the unearthly green light, was the source of the deep song. It was not an artifact in the traditional sense, no crafted tool or relic. It was a pulsating mass, roughly ovoid, embedded directly into the living rock. Its surface was a chaotic lattice of iridescent, obsidian-like scales that seemed to shift and ripple, constantly reforming. This wasn't just ancient, it was alien. It was a thing that defied categorization, a raw, living presence that pulsed with an intelligence utterly unlike his own. As he stared, mesmerized and horrified, the amethyst light within the pulsing mass flared. The chamber dissolved around him, not physically, but within his perception. He was no longer in the abandoned lighthouse. Tentacles, thicker than redwood trunks, black as the deepest ink, unfurled from the depths, coiling around the island's foundations. They were covered in jagged phosphorescent barbs that glowed with the same bruised amethyst light. He saw the lighthouse, a tiny, defiant beacon being slowly, inexorably drawn down. Then the vision shifted. He was no longer an observer. He was there, in the crushing blackness, surrounded by the churning, viscous liquid. The vision snapped back. Dean gasped, stumbling back against the damp rock wall, his breath ragged. The chamber, the pulsating mass, the green light, it was all there, but profoundly changed. The air crackled with malevolent energy. It intended to reclaim them. All of them. And the pulsing mass was its eye, its heart, its insidious gateway. He was already caught in its gaze. He knelt, fingers tracing the rough, cold stone, but the vibration wasn't in the stone. It was through it, resonating from beneath. The air, already heavy with salt and damp, now carried a faint, cloying scent, like stagnant brine mixed with something metallic and ancient. The thrumming intensified, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to bypass his ears and go straight to his bones. It felt like the entire structure of the abandoned lighthouse was a drum beaten from below. A sudden sharp crack echoed from the upper levels, followed by a groan of stressed timber. The single oil lamp he'd lit on the mantelpiece flickered violently, its flame dancing erratically, casting grotesque, elongated shadows that writhed across the walls like grasping tendrils. He pushed himself to his feet, a wave of vertigo washing over him. The floorboards beneath his feet felt unstable, almost fluid, as if the very ground was shifting. This wasn't just an external presence anymore. This was an intrusion. It wasn't a language he understood, yet its meaning was sickeningly clear. Yield. A pressure built behind his eyes, a dull ache that quickly sharpened into a piercing pain. It was trying to force its way in, to breach the fragile sanctuary of his mind. He wasn't just an observer in this nightmare. He was the target. The entity wasn't merely stirring. It was actively reaching for him, attempting to claim him. Panic threatened to overwhelm him, a desperate urge to flee. But where could he go? The abandoned lighthouse was an isolated beacon in a storm-lashed sea, a cage from which there was no escape. He stumbled backwards, bumping into the heavy oak table where his grandfather's journal lay, half open. The leather-bound book, with its faded, sea-stained cover, seemed to call to him. His grandfather, the previous keeper, had faced this. He had known. Dean's gaze fixed on the journal, a desperate, impossible hope igniting within him. There had to be something. A way. With trembling hands, he grabbed the journal, flipping through its brittle, yellowed pages with frantic urgency. The thrumming intensified, punctuated by the deep, resonant groans of the abandoned lighthouse, as if it were struggling against an unseen force. His eyes scanned the frantic, spidery script, paragraphs filled with increasingly desperate observations about the deep song and the drawing tide. He ignored the earlier entries, the meticulous logs of weather and supply ships, focusing instead on the later, more chaotic scrawls. It was covered in strange symbols and a fragmented, half-erased diagram. The language was archaic, almost indecipherable, but scattered amongst the arcane words were familiar terms. Seal, portal, severance. And then, a single stark phrase written in bolder, almost violent strokes. The binding requires a true heart, sacrificed willingly to hold the gate shut. Dean's vision blurred. A true heart, sacrificed willingly. He read it again, his heart sinking with each syllable. It wasn't a ritual of banishment, not a protective ward. It was a binding, a sealing, and it demanded a life. Not just any life, but one freely given, one of profound significance. His grandfather's final, desperate, incomplete thoughts were laid bare before him. The last few lines of the entry were smeared, as if the writer had been interrupted or had simply given up, the ink bleeding into the paper like dried blood. The implications hit him with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a way to save himself easily. It was a choice. A horrifying, impossible choice. He stared at the faded ink, the crude diagram of what looked like a swirling vortex, contained by strange, interlocking sigils. The deep song roared now, a deafening cacophony that vibrated his teeth. The abandoned lighthouse groaned, timber splintering, glass rattling in its frames. The icy tendrils were at his waist, chilling him to the bone, the whisper in his mind growing into a demanding chorus. Yield, yield. Dean gripped the journal, his knuckles white. The only way to stop it. And the sacrifice. He knew whose it would have to be. The journal lay open, its pages brittle beneath Dean's fingers, but his gaze was fixed on the window. The grim resolve that had taken root moments ago now anchored him against the storm that had begun to rage outside. A tempest unlike any he had witnessed since arriving on the island. This wasn't merely weather. It was a convulsion, a raw expression of the entity's fury, its awakening. The sky, a bruised purple-black, seemed to press down on the cottage, a suffocating lid. Rain lashed against the panes, not in sheets, but in thick, viscous ropes that slid down the glass like some dark, oil-slicked secretion. The wind, a keening shriek, clawed at the stone walls, finding purchase in every crevice, wailing through the chimney with a sound that was less air-moving and more a choked, guttural cry. He pushed away from the table, drawn by an awful curiosity to the small, grimy window. The world outside had dissolved into a maelstrom of gray and black. The familiar crags of the coastline were dissolving, their sharp edges softened by the driving rain, blurring into amorphous shapes. What truly chilled him, though, were the colors bleeding into the surf. Not the gray-green of the churning sea, but flashes of an impossible deep violet, a sickly ochre, blooming and fading in the roiling water near the shore. And the scent. The salt tang was still there, but now it was overlaid with something else. A metallic tang, like old blood, and a cloying sweetness, like decaying orchids. It was the smell of the deep but twisted, brought to the surface. It wasn't the natural undulation of seaweed in the tide. This kelp was thicker, its fronds unnaturally swollen, pulsing with a faint internal light that flickered like dying embers. And as he watched, one of the fronds detached itself, not torn by the waves, but pulling away, elongating, twisting, until it resembled a grotesque, skeletal hand reaching towards the cottage. This wasn't just the island's weather. It was the island itself, remaking itself, becoming an extension of the thing below. The psychic pressure was immense, a dull throb behind his eyes that intensified with every fresh gust of the wind. He felt his own thoughts fragmenting, slipping away like sand through his fingers. He returned to the table, his movements stiff, as if wading through unseen currents. The final pages of the journal were a jumble of symbols and fragmented sentences. But his grandfather's frantic marginalia had provided the crucial key. And the cost. Dean swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. The cost was not merely an offering of blood or sacrifice. It was an offering of self. He traced the final faded diagram with a trembling finger. The ritual demanded a deep, personal connection to the island, a binding of one's own essence to the ancient stones and the churning waters. It required him to become a conduit, a living anchor. He would not escape. He would become a part of the horror he sought to contain. This was the discovery, the terrible knowledge that sealed his fate. He would trade his freedom, his very self, for the cessation of the entity's encroachment. A fresh gust rattled the cottage, and something heavy scraped against the roof, a sound like a giant fingernail dragging across slate. He knew then that he couldn't delay. He had to reach the abandoned lighthouse. His grandfather's old lantern, heavy and brass, felt reassuring in his grip. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the scent of metallic decay filling his lungs. The wind immediately tore at him, trying to rip the oilskins from his body, to throw him off the narrow, winding path that led up the bluff. Rain bit at his face, sharp as glass shards. He squinted, trying to discern the path through the swirling chaos. The island itself was a nightmare made manifest. The sparse coastal floor had mutated, twisted into grotesque caricatures of themselves. What had been gnarled bushes now resembled skeletal hands, their branches tipped with needle-sharp thorns that seemed to reach for him. The ground beneath his boots felt spongy, strangely yielding, as if the very earth were softening, dissolving. He caught glimpses of iridescent slime glistening on rocks, leaving trails that pulsed faintly. The roar of the ocean was deafening, a hungry maw. But beneath it, Dean could hear other sounds now. A deep, resonant thrumming that vibrated through the ground, and a wet, sucking noise, as if something immense was pulling itself free from the mud. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the overwhelming symphony of the storm. It was his only destination, his only hope. Each step was an act of raw will, a defiance of the island's malevolent pull. But Dean pushed on, fueled by the terrible knowledge of the ritual, the immense personal cost, and the grim determination to see it through. He would not yield. Not yet. He finally reached the base of the abandoned lighthouse, its stone edifice a stark, imposing presence even in the maelstrom. The air inside was still, heavy, thick with the scent of salt, damp stone, and something else. Something ancient and waiting. He stepped inside, the wind slamming the door shut behind him with a resonant boom that echoed up the spiral staircase. He was here. He was ready. The storm was a living, thrashing beast, its claws of wind tearing at Dean's oilskins, its breath of rain lashing his face with icy needles. Each step on the uneven, rocky path was a battle, his boots sliding on slick stone, the roar of the ocean a deafening, primal scream. The beam of his flashlight, a struggling, anemic circle, fought against the absolute black, revealing only fleeting glimpses of the island's jagged, unforgiving coastline. The journal, tucked inside his inner pocket, felt less like paper and more like a leaden promise, a terrible burden. This wasn't me. The thought was a fierce, cold mantra against the rising tide of dread, against the insidious whispers that tried to seep into his mind, even now. He knew. His grandfather hadn't simply vanished. He had fought, and in some crucial way, he had failed. Dean wouldn't. He couldn't. The abandoned lighthouse loomed ahead, a skeletal finger against the bruised, churning sky, its glassless lantern room a gaping cyclopean maw. Rain streamed from its weathered stone, creating phantom waterfalls down its flanks. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with the scent of salt, decay, and something else. Something ancient and cold that settled deep in his lungs, tasting of forgotten depths. He began the climb, his hands scraping against the rough, cold stone of the inner wall. They spoke of things he couldn't grasp, concepts that frayed the edges of his understanding, visions of impossible geometries and crushing pressures. This wasn't me. He gripped the journal tighter, its brittle pages crinkling under his thumb, the resolve solidifying within him. The lantern room was a maelstrom. The storm raged outside, a furious external mirror to the chaos within. But here, it was the entity's presence that ripped at the very fabric of the air. A low, guttural thrum vibrated through the stone, shaking the very foundations of the lighthouse. The air shimmered, distorting the simple reality of the room, and in the center of the circular space, the space itself seemed to tear. It wasn't a portal, not a doorway, but a wound in reality. A rent that bled a lightless, viscous blackness, pulsating with an unseen, unheard rhythm. He unfolded the map from the journal, a cartographic diagram of the island's hidden ley lines, all converging at this very point. His grandfather's scrawled notes, urgent and desperate, indicated specific points around the room, arcane symbols to be drawn, an incantation to be spoken. And then, the final, most terrible instruction, etched in bold, trembling script. A life for a life, a soul for a tether. Dean understood. His grandfather had tried to seal it, to push it back, but perhaps he had lacked the specific living component needed for a permanent ward. Dean had it. His own life, his own soul, not as a sacrifice to be consumed, but as a living, conscious anchor. But the world, his world, would be safe. His profound personal tragedy, the crushing grief that had driven him here, now twisted into a terrible, unwavering strength. He had nothing left to lose, except the world itself. He began. He moved with a precision born of desperation, tracing the arcane symbols on the grimy stone floor with a piece of chalk he'd found tucked into a niche. He saw his lost loved one, smiling, then screaming, pulled into the blackness, their face contorted in agony. The final symbol. He stood before the gaping wound, the map clutched in his hand, his knuckles white. The words of the incantation swelled, his voice raw, echoing against the stone walls, fighting to be heard over the rising crescendo of the entity's unseen roar. It was a soundless scream that vibrated through his very bones, trying to shatter his will, to reduce him to a whimpering shell. But he pushed through. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, picturing the world beyond the storm, the sun on the water, the quiet towns, the distant, unassuming lives. He would give it all for that. He completed the final word, then, with a gasp of pure, raw defiance, plunged his hand, still clutching the map, into the viscous blackness. He was a lock, a living key, forever bound. The blackness recoiled, shrinking, struggling, like a dying leviathan, but he held firm, his will an unbreakable chain. The wound in reality stitched itself closed, leaving only a faint, shimmering scar on the air, a distortion that only he could now perceive. He collapsed, breath ragged, his body trembling uncontrollably, but the immense, crushing pressure was gone. He was alone in the abandoned lighthouse, forever changed, forever bound. He was the guardian now, the silent sentinel. The world was safe. But Dean, the cartographer, the man who had sought solace in solitude, was gone. He was merely the tether. The cold, salt-laced wind tore at Dean's coat as he stood at the precipice of the abandoned lighthouse, its beam long extinguished, its lens shattered. He understood now with a clarity that felt both liberating and damning. His grandfather hadn't just built a home here. He had constructed a cage, a lock, and Dean, unwitting until this moment, was the final living key. It sought to breach, to drag the world into its abyssal domain, and Dean felt its tendrils, not just in his mind, but in the marrow of his bones. He moved into the heart of the structure, the spiral stairs groaning under his weight, each step an ascent into an inevitable fate. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of brine and something else, something ancient and cloying, like stagnant marshland and forgotten death. He reached the lantern room, the shattered glass revealing a gaping maw to the raging storm outside. The rain lashed in, stinging his face, mirroring the frantic turmoil within him. His grandfather's journals had hinted at the sacrifice, not of blood, but of essence. A binding, a giving of self to the ward. He approached the central pedestal where the grand lens once rotated. It was scarred, etched with symbols he now recognized from the old texts, symbols of containment and resistance. A surge of power, not his own, but the island's, the Earth's, coursed through him. He closed his eyes, focusing, remembering the diagrams, the incantations, the sheer will his grandfather had poured into this place. A sharp, searing pain bloomed in his chest, then spread, like roots intertwining, binding him to the stone, to the island, to the very air. The deep song recoiled. He felt it, a vast, unseen intelligence withdrawing, shrieking not with sound, but with an internal vibration that threatened to tear his mind asunder. The pressure eased, replaced by a dull, persistent ache. The roiling chaos outside the lantern room seemed to lessen, the storm's fury momentarily muted, as if the ocean itself had paused to acknowledge the shift. When Dean opened his eyes, the world had changed. The rain still fell, the waves still crashed, but a profound quiet had settled within him, a stillness that was more terrifying than any storm. He was exhausted, utterly spent, yet imbued with an unsettling new awareness. He stumbled away from the pedestal, his legs weak, his body heavy. He was alone, utterly and irrevocably alone, bound to this desolate rock. The cost was clear, his freedom, his future, his very sense of self. The deep song had retreated, yes, but it was not gone. It was a dormancy, not a defeat. He walked to the edge of the lantern room, peering out at the tumultuous sea. The binding was absolute. To leave would be to break the ward, to unleash the deep song upon an unsuspecting world. He gazed out at the endless expanse of gray water, the fog already beginning to roll in again, obscuring the horizon.